Okay, let's get started with our final talk before our panel. I'd like to introduce Isabelle Boutron, who will be our next speaker. So good afternoon. So my talk is going to, first I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me. I'm just very honored to be here in this great institution. And my presentation is going to focus on distortion of research results in primary scientific literature and beyond, meaning the press releases and the mass media. Because my background is in the field of clinical epidemiology and epidemiology, I will mainly focus and give example in the field of randomized controlled trials. Doesn't seem to work. I should see my... that's far. Okay, I'll leave you. Is it okay? You win. Very far away. Okay, so when we're thinking about reproducibility of research, there's different domains that we could focus on. We can focus on the reproducibility of study design and conduct and try to replicate the methods of the study. We could focus on the reproducibility of the research results and using different data with the same methods and trying to obtain the same results. But we could also focus on the reproducibility of the interpretation and the conclusion of the study results. And this is what I'm going to focus on today. Indeed, there are some evidence that the same data provide very different interpretation. And for example, in this paper published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, the authors showed that there was some inconsistency in the interpretation of trial results by the research community and by the oncology community. When they looked at the research result, they found that most of the studies for a given treatment find statistically significant increase in overall mortality, but a very modest treatment effect. And they also found significant toxicity. And other studies did not find benefit for this drug on overall survival. Despite this very low level of evidence in favor of the efficacy of this treatment, the FDA approved the treatment in clinical practice, and the treatment was introduced into the guidelines. There was a very nice paper published in the JAMA performed by Richard Horton. Richard Horton did a qualitative study. What he did, he interviewed all co-authors of 10 articles published in The Lancet and asked them about the interpretation of their study results. And what he found, that there was an important disagreement between the authors about the importance of the finding, about the implication and direction of the implication of the results, and about the direction of future research. And this range of opinion, one of the scientists that co-authored exactly the same paper, was not at all reported in the manuscript. You also find that there was evidence of censored criticism. In fact, when we was interviewing the author highlighted several limitations of the study, the co-authors, but these limitations were not at all reported in the manuscript. There are also some disagreement in the interpretation of the results in the field of reproducibility science. And for example, the first paper that was performed on estimating the reproducibility of psychological science concluded that about 1/3 to 1/2 of the original finding were also observed in the replication study, but they were challenged by other authors, concluding that the data are consistent with the opposite conclusion, namely that the reproducibility of psychological science is quite high. So indeed, obtaining the same interpretation for the same results is challenging. When we are looking at the medical literature and the scientific literature, usually the interpretation of the study results and the study conclusions is reported by the scientist who performed the study. But these scientists are not neutral regarding the result of their study. They had a strong hunch, they had a strong hypothesis when they performed the studies. And so they have strong belief about what the results should be. They also know that the results, whether they are statistically significant or not, will have an impact on the level of publication. They know that if their result is statistically significant, they will be able to publish in a higher impact factor journals and more quickly. And that will have a direct impact on their future career and profit. So there is a concept that emerged in the literature, which is a new concept, the concept of spin in publication, meaning that a distorted interpretation of the results. So spin in publications was defined by analogies to spin doctors. It is defined by a way of reporting that could be conscious, but could frequently be unconscious, to convince the reader that the effect is higher than shown by the results. So if we are in the field of therapeutic evaluation and if we are evaluating a treatment in randomized controlled trials, a spin will be a specific way of reporting to convince the reader that the beneficial effect of the experimental treatment in terms of safety and efficacy is higher than actually shown by the results. We already know, and this was highlighted by Kay Dickerson this morning, that when we are reading the literature, we only have access to the tip of the iceberg. Well, spin in the literature is trying to make the iceberg look beautiful. So we were interested in this concept, and we tried to evaluate the prevalence of spin in published reports. We decided to focus on randomized controlled trials because randomized controlled trial is a quite straightforward design. You have a group of patients, you're going to randomize them. One will have the experimental treatment, the other group will have the comparator. You follow the patients, you assess the outcomes, and you compare the outcome with a statistical test. And we decided to select a representative sample of all randomized controlled trials, and we focused only on randomized controlled trials that clearly reported the primary outcome and for which the primary outcome was not statistically significant. So we had a sample of 72 randomized controlled trials, and we systematically assessed these reports to search for spin in the different sections of the manuscript. So these are our results. We found some spin in 18% of the title, spin in 29% of the results section, 43% of the discussion section, and half of the conclusion section. And overall, more than 40% of the reports had spin in at least 2 of the 3 sections of the main text. The type of spin that were used were very diverse. One very frequent strategy of spin was to focus on other statistically significant results. So, for example, the authors focused on statistically significant secondary outcomes or focused on within-group comparison. Instead of comparing the 2 groups, they compared each group before and after. They modified the population of analysis. Instead of doing an ITT analysis, they focused on per-protocol analysis, or they focused on subgroup analysis. They also misled the authors by inappropriate interpretation of the results, concluding that the negative results demonstrated equivalence between the 2 treatments, or concluding that the 2 treatments had comparable effectiveness, implying that the 2 treatments were effective. And there were also very innovative strategies. For example, in one study, they just compare the 2 groups to another study that was published somewhere else and concluded that both treatments were shown to be superior to an historical placebo control. Linguistic spin was also frequently used. For example, in this negative randomized control trial, the authors concluded that the treatment is expected to be a very important modality in the treatment strategy, while they did not demonstrate anything, or that the treatment effect approached but did not achieve conventional statistical significance, implying that treatment is probably beneficial and we shouldn't care about the p-value. And they also tend to, conclude that there's no safety issue. And for example, here they use the linguistic spin. We have demonstrated for the first time that with the treatment, the embryo implantation was unaltered. Rhetoric in research has been criticized by other authors. For example, Richard Horton in the BMJ in 1995 did a whole paper dedicated to rhetoric of research. And he looked deeply in the discussion section and focused on one manuscript. But he found some specific strategy to spin the discussion of the study results. And so the strategy were quite always the same. So an emphasis on the appropriateness and the security of the methodology used. The author usually discuss the limitations, but systematically provide extensive reassurance that despite this limitation, our methodology is very strong. They speculated about the clinical importance of the work, and this systematically repeated the results in the discussion section. Some also focus on statistical significance instead on clinical relevance. So this is an example of a randomized controlled trials that concluded that the experimental treatment is an active first-line treatment that significantly increases progression-free survival. When we looked at the results, this was right. There was a median progression-free survival that was statistically significantly longer in the experimental treatment group with a p-value of 0.024. However, when we looked at the magnitude of the treatment effect, it was an increase of 18 days on average on the progression-free survival. And so it's difficult to consider that this 18 days on average increase was a clinically significant improvement. Figures can also distort the interpretations. So this is the example of two figures of exactly the same data. So the only difference is that here they did a break in the scale. And as you can see, you can have a completely different impression when you're looking at the figures. And for example, here, you would very quickly conclude that there's a difference between PTA and medical treatment for the patients. While here, you will probably don't find any difference between the two treatments. We first assessed spin in a sample of negative randomized controlled trials, but other teams searched for spin for other design. And for example, there was some people who worked on spin in the field of diagnosis and accuracy study and found a high prevalence of spin. Spin were also found in cancer trials or in non-randomized studies evaluating and interventions. However, one of the questions is, do we care? Is it problematic to have spin in a published report? I mean, a lot of scientists are writing articles and they are reading articles. Will they be influenced by spin? Or are they able to see that it's a spin and to interpret correctly the results? So we wanted to evaluate that and to know whether spins had an impact on readers' interpretations. For this purpose, we performed the randomized controlled trials, comparing the interpretations by clinicians of the results of abstract reported with or without spin. So what we did, we selected a sample of abstract with spin, a sample of 30 abstract with spin that were published, and we did rewrite this abstract, and we deleted the spin or added the essential information such as the primary outcome, and we also had a very standardized conclusion. Then we invited 300 clinicians who were also corresponding authors of randomized controlled trials published in the field of cancer. And these clinicians were randomized to assess one abstract with spin or one abstract without spin. And then they had to, after reading the abstract, they had to answer a very simple question, which was our primary outcome. Based on this abstract, do you think treatment A would be beneficial for patients? From a scale from 0, very unlikely, to 10, very likely. So these are our results. Overall, clinicians were more likely to think that treatment A would be beneficial for patients when the abstract was reported with spin compared to the abstract reported with no spin. But it's important to highlight that the difference was modest, with a mean difference of 0.71. And statistically significant, but, and I probably had the answers related to that, but this needs to definitely be replicated. Another important question is, what is the role of peer reviewer for spin? Can peer reviewer reduce spin? To explore this, we assessed a sample of manuscript published in the BMC series journals. We focused on non-randomized studies evaluating an intervention, and we focused on these journals because these journals systematically give you access to the first manuscript submitted, the peer reviewer comments, and the answer from the authors. And so we examined all these, the first manuscript submitted, and all these documents. What we found was that 55% of the submitted, for 55% of the submitted manuscript, peer reviewer identified at least one spin in the articles. Of the spin that were identified by peer reviewer, 67% were completely deleted, 16% were partially deleted, and 17% were not removed. However, for 15% of the manuscript, peer reviewer requested the additions of spin. Then we looked at the abstract conclusion, because we know that the abstract is the most read section of an article, and the abstract conclusion is the most read section of the abstract. And we looked at the level of spin before and after the peer review. So we read the abstract, and we classified the abstract conclusion in no spin, low level of spin, moderate level of spin, and high level of spin. And on this figure, you can see the level of spin before the peer review and after the peer review. So for some conclusion, there is a decrease in the level of spin, going from high to no spin, but you also have some abstract conclusions that have no spin and that become high level of spin. And overall, there's not much change in the level of spin in the sample. Further, when we looked at the conclusion, we found that for 76% of the manuscript and of the abstract conclusion, peer reviewer failed to identify spin in the conclusion. Then we were interested in other type of research disseminations and what goes beyond the scientific articles, and specifically press release and the news. So what we did, our hypothesis at the beginning was that probably spin were added either, probably both at the press release level and at the mass media level by the journalist and by the people writing the press release. So to explore that, we selected a sample of press release reporting randomized controlled trials. And then we went back to the scientific articles and systematically searched the news related to these press releases. And we had, for 41 studies, the scientific article, the press release, and the news. And then we evaluated all these documents, especially in the scientific articles, we focused on the abstract conclusion, and we assessed the news and the press release. And these are our results. So when there is no spin in the abstract conclusion, in light blue here, usually there's very few spin added in the press release, and very few spin added in the news. But when there is spin in the abstract conclusion, we can find spin in the press release and spin in the news. So this went against our hypothesis that the scientists have a huge responsibility of the dissemination of spin and distorted interpretation of results in the news. Other people worked on this topic, and particularly Steven Voloshin and Lisa Schwartz, who worked a lot on press releases and the news. In this sample of press releases, this random sample of 200 press releases that they systematically assessed, they found that first, the choice of the study was very frequently debatable, with 17% of the press releases promoted studies, only 70% promoted studies with a strong design. They found that very important information were omitted in the press releases, such as the sample size or the results quantifications. And they also found that the interpretation was very often questionable. For example, 74% of animal studies claim relevance to human health, and 58% lacked relevant caution. A more recent study explored the dissemination of press releases to the news. So they systematically analyzed 462 press releases on biomedical and health-related science that were issued by 20 leading UK universities in 2011. They assessed these press releases. They found that 40% contained exaggerated advice, 1/3 contained exaggerated causal claim, and 36% contained exaggerated inference to human from animal studies. Then for all these press releases, they searched for news and found some news, and they evaluated the content of the news. So here you have the press releases that did not exaggerate, the news of the press releases that did not exaggerate the study results. When it's blue, it means that the news is not exaggerating the study results. So when the press release is not exaggerating the study results, most of the news, more than 80% of the news, are not exaggerating the study results. In contrast, when the press releases are exaggerating the study results, most of the news are exaggerating the study results from 60% to 80% of the news. Nevertheless, the journalists also add some spin in the news. So this is a case study of an article, a randomized control trial, the Accord lipid trials, that was evaluating phenofibrate added to statin. And the conclusion of the article, of the scientific article, was that phenofibrate, when added to statin therapy, was not associated with improved cardiovascular outcomes among patients with diabetes mellitus. But when they looked at the news, they found that 20% of the news concluded that phenofibrate was an effective treatment in this context. And of the articles providing recommendations for clinical practice, half of them recommended the use of phenofibrate. A very recent study was published in PERS 1 to evaluate the replicability of biomedical association studies that were reported in the newspaper. What the authors did, they selected 1,561 news, reporting 156 primary studies. They focused in these primary studies because for these primary studies, they had subsequent meta-analyses. And so they could compare the results of the primary study that were covered in the news to the results of the meta-analyses. So what did they find? First, they found that the type of study covered favored initial studies. 13% of initial studies were covered in the news, but only 2% of subsequent studies investigating the same questions were actually covered. The news also favors statistically significant results. No news covering initial study had null funding, had negative funding, and only 14% of the subsequent studies that were covered in the news had a negative finding. And finally, when they compared the results of the studies that were covered in the news to the results of the meta-analysis, they found that there was a replication in 34% in the initial studies and 56% of the subsequent studies. Again, the question is, what is the impact of this distorted interpretation of the news, and what is the impact of the news on science, and what is the impact of the news on public health? The impact of the news on science was evaluated in a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1991. The articles of the New England Journal of Medicine were systematically screened by the New York Times that identified some articles that they decided to cover. And the authors decided to compare the 10-year citations of the articles that were covered by the New York Times compared to the articles that were not covered by the New York Times. But you also had a period of time where there was a strike in the New York Times. And during this strike, the articles were identified, covered, but not distributed to the public. So they could compare also the 10-year citation of these articles that were selected and covered but not distributed to the control group. And what they found was that the article covered received 73% more citation than the control articles. But during the strike, the articles that were selected to be covered actually received slightly fewer citations. So it showed that probably being covered in such a journal will have an impact on the number of citations. It also probably has an impact on public health. This is a case study of 2 papers that were published in the BMJ in 2013. These 2 papers questions and raised an important debate about the use and the safety of using statin for patients who had a low risk of cardiovascular disease. And these 2 papers had a major media coverage. So a lot of media, particularly in the UK, discuss the risk of using statin for this type of patients. And one of the questions was, did this have an impact on patient care? So did patients stop the medications? Recently, and just to let you know that following this very important debate, Fiona Godley, who is the editor-in-chief of the BMJ, decided to write an editorials correcting the statements that were made by the authors related to the safety of the statin. So the impact of this media coverage on public health was recently evaluated by Matthew in a paper published in the BMJ. What they did, they used the prospectively collected electronic data from primary care from 2011 to 2015, and they had 88,000 records. And they did a time series analysis. So they could compare. So their outcome was the proportion of patients stopping statin when they were treated for primary prevention or when they were treated for secondary prevention. And they could do a time series analysis before the media coverage and after the media coverage. And the results showed that for both types of patients, there was an increase in the proportion of patients stopping statin for primary prevention and secondary prevention. But this increase stopped after 6 months. So after 6 months, the number of patients, the proportion of patients became like it was before. There was also a systematic review published by the Cochrane collaboration showing that although the number of studies and the quality of the studies is quite limited, but that there's some evidence that the channel of communication through mass media have an important influence on the use of healthcare interventions. So what should we do to reduce spin in published reports and spin in the news and the mass media? First, we could question the use of reporting guidelines. Indeed, we have lots of reporting guidelines that aim to increase transparency. However, when we look at the different reporting guidelines, they mainly provide the essential elements that should systematically be reported. And they provide very few guidance on how we should interpret the results. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that the interpretation of results, even a randomized control trial, which is quite straightforward, is very complex. And it's not a straightforward situation. And very often you have intermediate situation where you can't clearly conclude. So we could imagine to add some specific recommendation on how we should interpret the results and how we should avoid spin in published report in these reporting guidelines. We also could develop specific guidelines for journalists, and Lisa Schwartz and Stephen Foloshin have provided some general guidance. There are some authors that provide tips for interpreting scientific claims that are dedicated for the public, for the scientists, and for the journalist. And here you have 20 tips on how we should interpret scientific claim. We could also work on writing ed tool. When the author is writing his manuscript, it's at this time that he's going to interpret the results and write the interpretation of the results. We already developed writing ed tool to help people use the reporting guidelines, and we have evaluated this tool in a randomized control trial and showed that it improved the completeness of reporting. But we did not develop at all, and to my knowledge, there's no tool to help people avoiding inadequate claim. And so we have somebody in the team currently working on an assisted authoring tool for avoiding inadequate claim in scientific reports. Monitoring feedback is also an important tool. And I think we are in a situation where we want to change scientists' behavior. And so we need to rely on methods that help people to change behavior. And monitoring feedback has proved its effectiveness in the field of clinical practice guidelines, for example, help changing the practice of clinicians. And so we could use it for researchers and scientists. This has been done in the COMPARE trial project that was led by Ben Goldacker. What Ben Goldacker did is systematically screened all the randomized controlled trials published in the 5 highest impact factor journals in clinical research. And he systematically searched for switch in the outcomes in these articles. And then he had a process where every time he identified a switch in the outcome, he wrote a letter to the editors. Okay? And so overall, he evaluated 67 trials, only 9 were perfect, and he found that 354 outcomes were not reported, 357 outcomes were added. He did send 58 letters, but only 18 were published. But because he communicated a lot about this monitoring on his blog and in the press, he had an important impact. For example, for some studies, the authors responded and corrected their manuscript. And you even had the Annals of Internal Medicine, the editor, that changed his policy and is now requesting the publication of the protocol as a supplemental file of the article. We also have some people acting as watchdog, for example, the Health News Review, which is evaluating systematically the content of the news, identifying inadequate claim and informing the public about these inadequate claims. And probably we need to completely rethink the way we are writing manuscript. And I think we have a very old and very exactly the same way of writing manuscript, and probably we need to rethink the way we are doing it. I'm not sure it's a good idea to have the scientist who perform the experiment to provide the interpretation of the results. It's too much involved, and we probably need to reflect of all the disagreement that we can have on co-authors. So we could imagine a much more open and much wider process for the interpretation of the study results. And that should try to help obtaining sort of a consensus on the interpretation of the study results, and also be completely transparent with the disagreement with this interpretation of the study results. And I just use a quote that was proposed by Richard Horton in his paper on rhetoric. The need for this shift of ownership is that effective peer review will be achieved only when the language of a scientific paper is owned by the wider research community through moderation of the spin that authors place on their own work. Finally, we probably need to rethink the reward system we currently have. We have too much pressure to publish, and so this was proposed by John Ioannidis in 2 papers, particularly in PLOS Med and in JAMA, where he proposed to move from a reward system that is mainly focused on publications to a reward system that will focus also on high quality, reproducible, shareable, and translatable research. Finally, I also think we need to develop research on research and to do research on this topic and to try to develop interventions to improve the way we do research and to evaluate the intervention we do to perform research. So we were fortunate to obtain a funding from the European Commission to train 15 PhD students specifically on method and research. And so they're currently working on the planning, conduct, reporting, and peer review in the field of clinical research. So in conclusion, I would say that scientists are human, and when they are interpreting their research, they have hunches, they have vested interest, and so we need to consider that interpretation is a key part of research, which involved an important subjectivity, And if we want to move forward, it's supposed that the research community and the wider community accept that uncertainty is important and recognize the importance of negative results. And so we probably need to raise awareness of the lack of reproducibility of the interpretation and the presence of spin in the scientific publication. Thank you.